of webinars bringing together practitioners and academic experts to develop greater knowledge and understanding of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and its implementation in Australia. Today's webinar is on children's right to participation in practice. And first of all, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people on whose land the university and my home stands. And I note that sovereignty over this land was never ceded. And I also pay my respects to all Indigenous people participating in today's webinar or who will listen to the recording after the event. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child published its concluding observations of the 5th and 6th periodic reports of Australia in November 2019. And doing a search of that document, the word participation features in 3 different parts of the concluding observations. Firstly, in relation to sustainable development goals as far as they concern children. Also, this call for the Australian government to enhance children's meaningful and empowered participation in the family, in the community, and in schools, paying particular attention to girls, children with disabilities, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. And thirdly, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children should also be involved in leading and participating within communities in the development of solutions. The children's report that was published by UNICEF and the Child's Rights Task Force also mentioned participation on a number of occasions, and they also drew on statistics that showed that of children surveyed, only 19.8% reported that they felt they were able to have a say within the community on important issues all or most of the time. In the series of webinars that we've had, participation has been a really key theme in a lot of the topics that we've covered, and also in a lot of the questions and participation comments from those who have been part of the webinar series. So I'm really delighted now to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Noam Plague from UNSW, who's a senior lecturer there, and he's going to introduce our guest speaker for today. So thanks, Noam.
Thank you, Faith, for this opening remark, and good morning and good evening, everyone, depends where you are. I would like to start also by paying my respect to the medical people of the Euro Nation, where UNSW campus sits on, and to pay my respect to elderly, past, present, and emerging who are here with us today, and to any other Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person and Indigenous people from other countries around the world. The webinar enables us to bring people together. So we have guests from Sydney, from Australia, from the region, from Europe, from Africa. It's great to see so many of you joining us today to listen to what I'm convinced will be a fantastic webinar, not least because we are fortunate to be able to host Professor Laura Lundy with us to talk about the child right to participation. For those of you who don't know Laura, Laura is the co-director of the Center of Children's Rights and a professor in the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work at Queen's University, Belfast. And very good morning to you. It's 8 a.m. at your end. She's also the joint editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Children's Rights and qualified barrister of law. Laura has developed the Laura Lundy Model of Participation in 2007, which was then traveled around the world and has been utilized all over by adults and children alike. And we are going to spend today's afternoon learning more about the model and how the child right to participation as Faith an issue that came up almost in every webinar and workshop that we had in the last 3 years, how to make this right a reality for children. 2 housekeeping notes. If you can, please keep your microphones to mute. And if you have any questions during Laura's presentation, please put it on the chat box. And we hope to have as much time for discussion as possible. So without further ado, Laura, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for this. I too pay my respects to all Indigenous peoples here who may listen to the seminar and around the world. I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today. I'm really interested to hear your questions and to learn from you. I want to start by saying that, I'm here in Belfast in Northern Ireland, but I want to acknowledge that Some of the best scholarship in the world on children's rights comes from Australia, including from my two hosts. And some of the best participation practice in the world comes from Australia. And I think we're all on a journey here, and none of us have got it quite right. And what I'm hoping is that my approach helps you think about it in another way. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to do a very short introduction to the Lundy model of participation. I'm going to then explain just with some practical examples of how it's been put into practice. And then so far as time allows, I'm then going to look at some myth busting, some of the things that I think are common misunderstandings and barriers to effective child participation. So starting with the model itself, I'm not going to say a lot about the Convention on the Rights of the Child in Article 12, because I know this is a specialist audience that understands that we're looking at this from a child rights perspective. And this is the key provision, Article 12. A long, complex and convoluted provision, and I'm going to come back to that and explain in part why I ended up with the Lundy model. So where did it start? It started for me in the work of our Children's Commission. I know that you have some really strong Children's Commissioners, and I think their work is so important in child participation in lots of ways. But this is where ours started. When our Children's Commissioner was first appointed back in 2003, he commissioned a study of children's experiences in Northern Ireland, and I ended up as the principal investigator of that study. And something happened with me then. We were asked to capture children's views, and we captured about just over 1,000 children's views on their experience of their rights. And something strange happened to me. I was a lawyer and I was looking at child rights from the legal text, and in particular the legal text of Article 12 of the Convention, which I've just shown. I was then doing a lot of the adult interviews. We were interviewing stakeholders, social workers, teachers, lawyers, doctors, nurses. And whenever we asked them, what about Article 12? They would have said, Article what? Fair enough. Article what? Why would they know? But if we said, well, it's the obligation to listen to children, take their views, they would say, of course, yes, of course we do that. That's in our competence, our professional competence, say the voice of the child, or pupil voice, or student voice. Meanwhile, in the middle, we had the data from the children. And what was coming back from that data very clearly was that children in Northern Ireland, even though they had this right, and even though adults said they were doing it, children were telling us that their views were not being sought, or if their views were being sought, they were not taken seriously, or if their views were not sought, but they offered them anyway, that often they were considered to be being cheeky or disruptive. So we had this disconnect, this real disconnect between the text, the adult competence and understanding, and what children were actually experiencing. And what happened then was I started to really think critically about this concept of voice of the child, which is used a lot. And what I concluded was that this term and other terms like it, these abbreviations, and I know the abbreviations are necessary. I started with the long text of Article 12, which does not trip off the tongue. It's very hard to repeat verbatim. But each of those abbreviations essentially is an imperfect summary, and each of them had the potential to undermine the implementation of Article 12. And I was convinced about that. And I think we need a new way of summarizing this that captures the legal content, but does not sacrifice accessibility. And what I came up with then was I wrote an academic article, because that's what we do. And the title was Voice is Not Enough. And I suggested then that to understand this provision, you had to first, like all human rights provisions, not disassociated from the rest of the convention. It has to be understood in the context of the other rights, in particular to non-discrimination, best interests, etc. I'm going to speak about that. But I suggested that actually you needed to think about it in two parts: the right to express a view, and then the right to have those views given due weight. And that a better way of understanding that was not to think of voice of the child, but was to think of space, voice, audience, and influence. And that's the original diagram that was published in the journal article. And I'd stopped using it because it looks so quite dull. And there have been so many people have produced such nice ones since. But actually, I think it's important to go back to because it is the one that actually locates it within the rest of the convention. I would change it now, and with my colleague, Dr. Brona Byrne, we've written a version which integrates it with the UNCPRD because I think it's really important. And we're looking at other conventions as well. Okay, so where are we now? This is the brand new, latest, nice, colourful version of the Lundy model that was launched last week by the Irish government, but I'm going to come back to that. What I'm saying basically is that space means children given the opportunity, voice being facilitated, audience being listened to, and influence acted upon as appropriate. I'm going to really briefly take you through each of those 4 concepts before I look at what it means in practice. So space, looking at the legal text, it says assure, very strong word in a human rights treaty, assure to the child. And I think that means it has to be actively created. We're not waiting for children to happen to tell us. That actually as duty bearers and those with obligations to listen, we have to actively create these opportunities for children. Secondly, it needs to be a safe space. And that is somewhere my own thinking has been developed a lot by the ways in which other people have used it. Initially, what I said is that children should not be afraid of rebuke or reprisal. And many children still are afraid of rebuke or reprisal whenever they share their views. But lately, I've been looking a lot in the child protection space, and I was really taken by the report by the New South Wales Guardian that was launched a couple of weeks ago, really looking at how you combine protection and participation, because that is crucial. It has to be a safe space in terms of a child, for instance, who wants to report some kind of violence or abuse. So that concept of safe, and also I think in your context and many others, mine included, that it has to be a culturally safe space, that actually has to be somewhere where people are comfortable from their own cultural perspective. It needs to be an inclusive space. This is really about non-discrimination, and Faith listed at the start some of the categories that the Committee on the Rights of the Child expressed concern about. So in terms of your Indigenous Aboriginal people, the Torres Strait Islanders, I was really curious to see that girls were also on that list, and I would really like to talk about that in the questions afterwards, because I wasn't expecting that. And of course, children with disabilities, who appear everywhere and are one of the most excluded groups. Voice, the right to express a view freely. We know it's a right and not a duty. You know, children are entitled to, they can't be forced. They should have choice in the mode of expression. I think that's actually crucial to practical delivery, that we don't create one option because children express themselves in different ways. What we know now and didn't know as well then is that this is the first part of the right is afforded to all children capable of forming a view. That is not limited by age and maturity. And what we find is often a decision is made that because a child will not be able to say anything sensible or will not understand the issues, we don't give them the option. And that is not what the legal text says. It does not matter whether their view is mature. If they're capable of forming it, they're entitled to express it. And they may need help to form and express views, which I'll come back to. Third concept is audience, which sometimes gets neglected. And in some ways, I think this is actually the most crucial step. And that is that saying it was more than being heard, but active listening and engagement, this concept of due weight. The seriousness of that due, give something its due, is actually quite a weighty obligation. And in the original article, I talked about needing formal channels of communication, a right of audience. And more lately, I like the concept of a dedicated listener, that we identify the duty bearer. Who are the people with the power to effect change? And it may not be one person, it may be many people for different issues. And that when we identify those people, we make sure that's where children's views are getting to, because sometimes they're not, and that's not thought through. And then finally, influence, which of course is the holy grail of child participation, that the things are given due weight in accordance with age and maturity. And in some ways, the original model was weaker here, and I'm going to come back to where I am now on that. I said then, as lawyers do, when you can't deliver substantive justice, you go for procedural justice. And I was thinking that there should be a formal response, that we needed to know about the feedback should be given about the extent of influence they had. And I said then, and I'll show you how I'm trying to do that now, to create the conditions where it is uncomfortable for adults to solicit children's views and then ignore them, that we had to do that. And I think we're getting better at that, but this is still one of our big challenges. Okay, that's the model. I'm then going to show you what has been happening in practice with it. I didn't anticipate that it would take off. I wasn't trying to create a model. I didn't call it the Lundy model. In fact, I resisted that. Other people did. I said that what I wanted to do then was create something that was legally sound and user-friendly. And of course, it has taken off, and lots of people have found it really useful. And I think one of the reasons for that is that I think it's almost like a paint by numbers. People are able to color themselves into these concepts. And that's what I love about it, and what I'm looking forward to today, is that people are able to take and understand space and then think, what does that mean in my context with these children, you know, in this particular circumstance on this issue? I wasn't trying to create a model, was the first thing. I wasn't trying to capture the qualities of rights-based participation. I was a lawyer coming at that with data from children. There are lots of models that capture different forms or levels of participation. The most famous and seminal of that is Roger Hart's ladder participation, which is an incredible piece of work that changed all our perceptions on child participation. But this isn't an alternative to that because it does a different thing. It talks about the qualities. I really like this version of it. It was produced by UNICEF in a guide to conceptual understanding of adolescent participation by the fabulous Jerison Lansdowne. They got a bunch of experts together in New York, including myself, and looked at what if you brought all these concepts together. What I really like about this is not just that it has my model in there, but that it has Jerison's 3 concepts of collaborative, consultative, and child-led adolescent there. These are the forms of participation. And it talks about the ecosystem of participation, the courts, national government, and then it talks about what's an enabling environment for participation. So I don't think many people know it, but I find it a really helpful way of looking at participation as a whole. So I'm drawing it to your attention. In terms of the Lundy model then, I mean, the strongest and best example, and not just because I'm Irish, the strongest and best example of it being put into practice is the Irish National Government. In 2012, they decided that in response where you are to a committee's criticism, they decided that they needed to do more. And they decided they would have not just a children's strategy, they would have a child and youth participation strategy. And they produced one, and they centered it around the Lundy model. And I worked with people from every government department and agency, and they said they needed something, handy. They needed something that they could access easily. And we worked to create this checklist. So you can see each of the concepts is given 3 quite simple questions with yes or no answers. And that checklist really took off. It's been used all over the world, used by the World Health Organization, the European Commission. So people are hungry for ways of understanding this, but they needed to be given to them in ways that don't lose the meaning, on the import and the rights content, but enable them actually to apply it. So that's where it was. That idea of having a national strategy was incredibly important. And Noah and I had a conversation about what happens about implementation. And what they did, it had a proper strategy with proper targets, proper reviews, individual targets. And I think the very first picture there is just a screenshot from one of their midterm reviews. So every 2 years, they review the action points, they check have they done it, they update the action points, and you can see that all the way down that. And this is just, it covers every aspect of Irish life. This is just some around play, bike week, bodies of sport. Every single body and agency receiving public funding has actions around child and youth participation. The other 2 examples are, and there are many of these, but I like these in particular. One is the Oberstown Campus Council. That is the Irish Youth Detention Centre, where my colleague Ursula Kilkelly is the chair of the board. They have their own youth participation strategy in the detention centre based around the model. And the other one is the TUSLA is their child and family agency, so their big child protection department. They have a really detailed strategy with lots of action points. They have trained all their staff on the Lundy model. They have money attached to it. Children are given budgets. They have their own charter written with their children. So that one act of the government of taking a strategy has had this cascading knock-on effect. And again, it's still happening. So this is where they are now. This was launched last week, and I'm incredibly proud of it. So again, working with them, and they have a participation hub now that services all of government and actually the NGOs and the private sector, and they've developed their own participation framework. And the 2 new tools that I think are really useful and interesting is the feedback came back that the original checklist was great, but it didn't work for everyday practice. It didn't work if you were a teacher in a preschool. It didn't work if you were a pediatric nurse or a social worker out in the field. So we've created an everyday checklist, which is the first image. Very simple questions, and these questions have been written in conjunction with practitioners, and they're great. And they would come back and say, can we add this question, like how can children raise the things that matter to them? And of course that should have been a question in the first checklist. So we're improving all the time. And the final picture is something else which I really like. It's a 1-page evaluation form for children written with a group of children that captures whether or not in a participatory process they think it was effective. Final example then is, there are so many I could do, but this is one I like. It's lots of city councils across the world have used it. This is Leicester City Council. who have really gone for it and have won awards for it. And they have created all sorts of mechanisms within the council with a really genuine attempt to ensure that children, including the most marginalised children, particularly, for instance, children in care, they have a care experience council working across delivering, deciding on commissioning of services and delivery of services. And I think they're just doing a wonderful job. But I want to end the practice bit with this, because when I was sent this, and this is from a young woman who was a member of the Care Experience Council in Leicester, I got goosebumps, because I've seen so many descriptions of my approach to child participation, which is great. And some of them do it better than I did it, which is also great. But this young person just totally captured its value. And one of the things I'm proud of is that not just that adults understand it, but children and young people can see themselves in the space. And I can't read it all to you, but I've since met her, Tash, and had permission to use this. She describes voices as it doesn't need to be profound or difficult. And I think sometimes we create this apparatus around participation, which can have a chilling effect. It can make people feel they can't do it. But she said it doesn't need to be this. It can consist of simply having someone to talk to. Audience, she's saying, absolutely gets it. Idea of being able to communicate ideas to someone who can help and make a difference, okay, which is what I was trying to say earlier in more words. And then influence isn't always about seeing change, but knowing why things may not be able to change. And the way that is communicated is so important, regardless of outcome. Being able to know you're able to have your say and even have the ability to have some type of influence is powerful. So I think Tash gets it. Okay, so what I want to finally say in that section is there is no one right way to do child participation. It is child, decision, and context specific. So I'm not here to say any of that, but I do think there are some myths around child participation. And Noam, stop me when my time is up, because I could go on all day on myths. I could do hours of myths, but I'm just going to do a few. I think this statement, and I used to say it myself, children are the experts in their own lives. And I think that can be dangerous, because in some ways it, is saying that it's their decision, and that is not what the rights-based framework is. The responsibility in that usually and primarily is on the adult decision maker, the duty bearer, and their obligation is to involve children. Children have expertise in their own lives. I think children are the experts in their own feelings and mostly their own experiences, but actually this idea that this is participation as a collaboration, that actually this is what a decision-making process that is Article 12 compliant is like. It undermines adult authority. I'm not going to say too much about that, because I think most people in this room will understand that. But I do think constantly that we're battling against this assumption that when we let children into conversations, we're undermining expertise or authority, or that we'll let them make really bad decisions. And we know that's not what the rights-based framework does. That has to be understood in the context of their other rights. And there's times whenever we have to think whether what a child wants is actually something we can deliver, because it may undermine one of their other rights, perhaps for instance, their right to be protected from harm. They're too young. I hear that so often. Well, you couldn't talk to children under 10, you couldn't talk to children under 8, you couldn't talk to children under 6, you couldn't talk to, of course you can. The issue is, are they capable of expressing a view? And if they're capable of expressing a view, they're entitled to be heard. And I think there is an excellent practice in Australia in listening to the views of very, very young children. So I'm not going to say so much about that, except that is a myth, and that we have to think that this applies to all children. The weight we give to their views, depending on the issue, obviously might vary with age and maturity, because that's in the obligation, but we can't rule young children out right from the start. They're not representative. This is where I'm doing some work on myself at the minute, because it's one of those things that I think is used to exclude children who come to present in groups. We know that the right is a right of individual children and a right of groups of children, collective participation. And I've just seen so many children undermined by turning up as a group to say something and then being questioned on their, who they are and who they represent and whether they're representative enough. And that's a picture of the Westminster Parliament voting for Brexit. And I just want to say that, they represent me. Are they representative, And actually, I think there are questions around this notion of what representative means. And at the minute, I've just embarked on a study with some young people about how they define representative and what they think representative looks like and how you can become representative. But I think it's one of the areas where we've work to do. And then finally, this is where my latest work has been, is this concept of tokenism. And I'm really deeply concerned about the idea that often children are excluded from decision making because adults say it would be tokenistic. And I think that they want a pat in the back for saying that, because I think we have created the conditions where we think that tokenism is non-participation, and that what they're saying is, well, I wouldn't want to do it if I can't do it well. And actually, I find that really problematic from a human rights perspective. There's no other human right where you would say, because I can't do this well, I am not going to try. Because I can't give you good education, you're getting none. Because I can't give you good access to healthcare, you're getting none. Because I can't protect your privacy fully, I'm not going to protect it at all. And I'm saying that actually, really, we have to problematize this phrase and how we use it. I'm not saying we should be tokenistic, but I think that sometimes it depends how you define tokenism, and tokenism can be a start, in the sense that trying to do something, even where your resources and time is limited, I think is usually better than doing nothing at all. And I will talk to you if we have questions about that, about the idea of disengagement. So participation is always perfect, and tokenism may be a start. And this is my issue. This is from the original paper. The right to be heard is not in our gift. It's not us bestowing this on children, this favor that we do them, we bring them into conversations. It's their entitlement, and we've got to start to see it from an entitlement perspective. And that is what a rights framework does. So obviously I don't want us to be tokenistic, and where I'm working now is what can we do to create strategies for securing the greater likelihood of influence. Law has a role, education and training has a role. What I'm saying now is that I really have gone back to the concept of feedback and what feedback looks like. And I think often the feedback that we give children is very poor. It's very weak. It will say things like, thank you so much for telling us your views. Your views are really important to us. We're going to take them really seriously, and nothing more. And I think that actually, when you think of it from a human rights perspective about accountability and transparency, feedback is that main mechanism for delivering accountability and transparency. So where I'm at now is saying a new framework, a 4F framework, and I joke, but I'm not really joking, is that often children are so frustrated about what happens to their views that the F word is used. And I'm trying to kind of reclaim the F word. And I'm saying that it should be fast, full, child-friendly, and followed up. And what I want to concentrate on my very last slide is what I mean by full. And I think that it's the quality of the feedback we give. And this is the kind of critical juncture in the child participation process that we make sure that we do it well. And I'm suggesting that every time you or I or anybody takes children's views, ask them to give us their time to tell us what they think, that when we respond to them, that we make sure we do this in a way that really engages, gives the due weight. And that was saying, we should be asking ourselves questions like, what did I agree with? Why? What surprised you? Why? Did you disagree with anything? What did you disagree with? Why did you disagree with it? Has it influenced it? If so, how? What have you decided? When is it happening? And so this new framework is now part of the Irish national framework, and I'm really hoping that it in itself will be taken and will develop. So that's me. That's my presentation of the Lundy Model in practice, and some of the myths. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Laura, for this fantastic presentation. It gives us a lot of, I'm sure for all of us, a lot to think about. So while our participants are hopefully putting their questions in the chat box, I would like to kickstart with a question. Assuming that you convinced us that children A should participate and should be able have the opportunity to participate, and you laid the pathway of how it should be done, the question is, how do you start? We have some guests here who work in government, in local government, with NGOs, and we'd like to take it on board. Where do you start? You just go down the street and tap on the shoulders on some children?
Well, that is the thing. There's a really, really easy answer to that question, which is, and it's the answer to almost every participation question that I get asked, is ask children. You know, where do you start? You ask children, where do you start? You know, so what you're asking though is, how do you find those children? Yep. And I think that's a different question. Of course, what I haven't talked about today is, you know, obviously my centre, we do a lot of work, of child participation work globally, and so we have to start somewhere. And I think the first thing that you must do is identify the children who are the proper audience and target for whatever it is you're trying to do. So for instance, if you're going to create a strategy on children with disabilities, you don't go and talk to children who don't have disabilities. You have to go to children who have disabilities. And then when you go to children with disabilities, you don't just go to children who have physical disabilities, because if it's going to be children with all the range of disabilities. So I think you identify who it is, which children are going to be impacted. And then I think, I mean, Australia is large and diverse, but you're rich and connected, you know. And I think one of the things that I've been doing work at the minute, for instance, with the Andorran government, and they're tiny. And whenever I was speaking to them and they were asking, where do we start your question? No, how do we do this? Where do we go? And I just said they had access to every single child in their schools. Now, not all children in schools, and we can talk about that. And they were able to just do it. They've run a survey, and they've got a response from every child in their schools, you know, because they're the government. Do you know, they've access to this, they can put this out, you know, if you want to do it survey wise. And obviously if you want richer, you have to do focus groups, but again, they have access. Public decision makers have access in the ways that, you know, those of us outside that do not and have to beg for it. So that's where you start. And then when you go there, you ask children, you know, as
do you have any idea?
So there's a different talk, which would be, we have a rights-based approach, CRBA, we developed in our centre, and our 2 questions when we go to children are, what do we need to know and how should we know it? What should we ask and what approaches should we use? That's our CRBA to research. Does that answer your question, Noam?
It does, and if anyone has any further questions about the practicality of it, please put it on the chat box. Michael Pecker raises a skeptical voice asking, what should we do with children who are being influenced by others or being coached by others, especially parents, in the context of family law proceedings, and how your model can mitigate that?
So how the model, I mean, you're never, no model or approach is ever going to probably get past a situation where if you have a type of parental alienation where a child is being manipulated in the context of anything, I'm not just talking about family law, that can be challenging, but all the more reason that we concentrate on the first dimension, or the first 2 dimensions of my model, the space and the voice, that you have to create that really safe space. And again, I'm doing work with some colleagues in the University of Edinburgh on the Barnahus model, which I don't know if it's in Australia, but this is, you know, the children's house where children who are victims of violence or witnesses go and give their story once. And we're using the model to apply to Barnahus, and we're thinking very much about space and the relational space and how you create that trust where children can feel that actually they can tell you what really happened or what they really think in the context of manipulation or fear or all of those other things. So it is a challenge, you know, it is a challenge. I don't think that's skeptical. I think that's just realistic to acknowledge at times that will be really hard, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And I think there are people who are expert, like the Barnahus interviewers, in doing that.
Thank you. Jack is asking if you can unpack and say a little bit more about the differences between participation and consultation.
That's a really hard question. You know, I think there are 2 schools of thought. One's bigger than the other, and one's not. Okay, I'm a pragmatist here. I think probably participation is bigger and consultation is one version of that. And I showed to you at the start Jerison Lansdowne's model, and I really like that. It's her concept of collaborative or child-led consultation, collaborative or child-led, and she would see them on a spectrum. So consultation is the adult goes, takes children views, come back. A lot of my work is consultative. Collaborative is we sit together with children and we decide what do we want to know and how do we want to know it. Child-led is child-led. Okay, I love that. I love the simplicity of that, and I love the way that our 2 models work together. So I would put that under the whole umbrella of participation. But I know there are people who would flip that. But that's my take. You know.
Thank you. Annie Ratu asks whether children should have a say at the highest level of decision making, or can you really rely on indirect participation of children and then feed it from the local level up the chain? And if I can, I will top up this question by saying that we have a compulsory voting for anyone be above the age of 18. And in that context, do you think the voting age, minimum voting age, should be lowered, and so it will include children as well?
Okay, I'm not sure I followed the first question about levels. Is that back to the idea, the highest level? What do you mean by level? Do you mean like a national government level, or do you mean the highest level as in child-led? Which one?
The highest level of government, yeah.
Okay, of course I do, yeah. I mean, and I think there are different ways. I mean, that's what I think is we're talking about with what I showed with the Irish government. Now, I even think it's imperfect in its ways, and we've seen other countries set up, that, particular Canada and Scotland, they have the Prime Minister that has their own panel of young people. There are lots and lots of ways to do this. And I think, people have to decide what's right for them. I think we've done a lot of work on children in public decision making in terms of youth parliaments, and I'm super excited at the minute because we're setting one up finally in Northern Ireland, and it's going to launch on April 26th. And I've been involved in advising on that, and it's really interesting to see, ways in which that's connected. Does it run in parallel? How do you bridge in, to the actual actual assemblies? I think there are lots and lots of ways of doing it. But yes, the answer is yes. Of course, I do think that. I don't think it's the only way. And I think a lot of my own work at the minute is not actually on those formal decision-making spaces. It's on youth-led space. I've done quite a lot of work in the last year on children human rights defenders. And that's not an Article 12 situation. These are children who are exercising their civil and political rights, to freedom of association and assembly. And that's a different space. And they can get themselves into the very highest levels of decision-making. Look at Greta Thunberg in a very different way. And we need to do both. And then the second question, Noam, was yours, which was, sorry, remind me.
About the tying into the question of participation in decision in the higher level, the national level, whether the minimum age for voting should be lower.
Voting, sorry, yes, of course. Yeah, I think obviously the convention left this out, and we know that there's a lot of criticism of the convention because it didn't address these political rights. I think Article 12 in some ways exists because they don't have the right to vote, because children, because they're disenfranchised. I think that obligation to give their views due weight exists because of the lack of right to vote. But what's really interesting is that they're using that space to argue for the right to vote. And of course, I would be very supportive of lowering the voting age for all of, there's a huge literature there showing there's an appetite for that. There's a resistance to it too, but why not? And we've got some really good examples across the world now of voting lowering, and we want children to engage. Yeah.
Thank you. James Dougal asked if you can say a little bit more about the Berhanus model that you just mentioned.
The which model? Sorry, no.
The Berhanus model from the juvenile.
Oh, Barnahus. Okay. Yeah. No. It's not my expertise, but I'm learning so much. So Barnahus is approach developed in Iceland, and actually, it's one of the UN committee members. It's his model, and he looked at this notion that children are constantly, whenever they report a crime, and usually we're thinking about abuse. That they're interviewed in this process by police, by social workers, by doctors, by lawyers, and that this process in itself was abusive. And he created a house literally in Reykjavik in Iceland where, and got everyone to agree that basically the child would be interviewed once by a skilled forensic interviewer. And then there would be a screen, and behind that screen sits the judge and sits the lawyers, the prosecution and the defense, social workers. In that house, the child gets their medical examination, they get their counseling, they get the interview. So the child does not have to be traumatized by repeating their story. And I think whenever I met Bragi, I came to something where I presented the model, and he said, we do space, voice, audience, and influence. So, and I think they do on the individual level, but they don't at the collective level, the design of the houses, the strategy side. So I'm currently working with the Promise Network, which is the European collection of Barnahus. And we're looking how to develop a participation model. And James, that is really pushing up so many issues around that balance of child protection and child participation. So I'm giving a keynote at a conference, the Nordic Conference in Child Protection. And I'm really struggling and trying to think about how to balance those things with my model in child protection. So that's where I'm at the minute. Any help with that anybody can give me would be great.
That's a challenge for all of you. Thank you. When the guy asked about the differences between participation and child inclusive cities, alluding to many cities adopting the concept of inclusive cities and an inclusion of vulnerable groups in local urban governance. And can you say something whether your model speaks about the differences between child participation and child inclusive frameworks?
Yeah, I came at it from child participation, and I put inclusion as a dimension of that, the non-discrimination, but of course it's way more than that. And I think I mentioned briefly that I think this is the next step for the model in some ways, and not just for the model, for child participation, is that my co-director in my centre is Dr. Brona Byrne, who specialises in children's rights and disability. And it occurred to us this year that why had we not actually put the CRC together with the CRPD? And so for a recent publication, we've merged them. And I realized actually we've got to do that for everything. You know, we've got to bring the other things in to create it doesn't have to be my model, but we have to have more inclusive, capture the intersectionality of the fact that children are not just children, they're children with disabilities, they are Indigenous children, they are girls, you know, and I think there's something that we can do actually to move this on again. And that's a space that I think some other people are in with my model, and I'm going to go in with Brona on disability. Yeah, but then in terms of the inclusive cities, again, this is somewhere I often think of Australia and Melbourne, which is one of those original kind of child-friendly cities doing really great participatory work. The Children's Plan is one of those really like early examples. And I really like the fact it's gone for, you know, a child, just child-friendly to inclusive, because one of the examples I love comes from a colleague at the University of Melbourne, who's an early childhood specialist, Kylie Smith. And Kylie did part of that consultation on the Children's Plan with very young children, toddlers, because she ran the nursery as well as being a senior lecturer. And she always tells a story about taking children on a tour of the city. And one of their problems was that the time they had to cross the road wasn't enough for their little legs. So one of the things they complained about is the timers on your crossing buttons, giving them extra time. And of course, extra time was great for people who have mobility issues, you know, as well. It wasn't just about children. And actually what can be good for children can be good for others, because it makes inclusive cities generally.
Thank you. Let's take Antonia and Georgia's questions together, essentially asking if you can comment and say a little bit more about the potential tension between promoting children's participation and the view that they're too vulnerable to participate, for example, if they are victims of crimes or child trafficking, or because they should be shielded from being involved in the decision-making process. They should not be burdened with participation.
Yeah. No, I feel really strongly about this, and again, it's partly what I'm working on at the minute, but it's something in a talk we did work on the UN Global Study on children deprived of their liberty, and I've done some work actually with Faith. We've done work on modern slavery and have had to have conversations about this. And I think one of the concepts that I'm suggesting now is, and I didn't have time today, is that vulnerability should not eclipse agency. And I'm deeply concerned that children who are considered the most vulnerable are excluded for those reasons given. And I think there are very strong arguments that in fact, when you have children who are most vulnerable, often because they've been deprived of their liberty, modern slavery, in detention, victims of, you know, horrendous abuse, that it's even more important. It's always an entitlement, but it's even more important that those children are given agency and a capacity for self-determination in the context of what's happening to them. So I feel really strongly about that. I think that what we need to do is create conditions where they are safe to do that, but I absolutely don't think that we should just say you know, that it will make them unsafe. We have to really create the conditions where we do make them safe, you know.
Candice is asking about the utility of the model and utility of participation in not necessarily in developed countries, but rather in countries where adults and children experience restrictions on freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. And the more specific question that Candice asked is, what are the possible entry points then for children and for adults who would like to facilitate this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't suggest the model is a model for delivering civil and political rights. I think that is a different thing. I mean, I think Article 12 is one dimension of a civil and political right, but if it's about freedom of association and freedom of assembly and about, you know, those you know, youth-led or child-led movements, I think we need a different framework, and I'm working on one. That's why I spent all of last year's lockdown on two things: the Irish National Framework and on a guide called, which we could share. I worked with it with Child Rights Connect and with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and with the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, and a massive collaboration of every NGO working on these issues across the world. We produced a guide which reads the Convention on the Rights of the Child with the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, because children aren't seen to be human rights defenders, even though they're acting as human rights defenders. And actually they're often shut down by minimum age requirements. They can't form an association till they're 18. They're not allowed to go to the protest. You know, they're not allowed to leave school. So we've been grappling with that for a year, and we've produced a guide that we're really proud of. And the next phase of this guide is to produce practical guidance And we have been working with a group of children human rights defenders from all over the world. So not just, Western Europe and other, Australia, New Zealand. And we're working with children all over the world to make that real in their context. But the point is important because it will be different in different contexts. And most of the children that we're working with have been working in Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
Excellent. Thank you. While we're waiting for more participants to put in their question, I would like to come back to an issue that came up a number of times this afternoon, which is about girls' participation. And I was wondering, and following what Faith was saying at the beginning, about the recommendation that the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child have said about Australia and the need to increase and to encourage girls to participate locally. I was wondering if you can say a little bit more about the, I would say, common assumption that girls have less voice than boys and than young men in many cultures, and how this can be overcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Noam, that it is absolutely a major issue. And again, the work that we've been doing on children human rights defenders, we did a global survey for the committee for its DEV general discussion in 2018. And one of the big issues there were girls telling us that for cultural reasons, that even more so than they were like doubly bound by the fact they were a child and then they were a girl child, and the fact that those things meant they were absolutely not able to talk. And actually in that work, the young women in those communities who are out working on issues like early child marriage, or child marriage is always early, sorry, child marriage is just wrong, that they get even enhanced abuse, and because the very fact that they're doing it because it's not just because they're a child, it's because they're a girl and a child, and that actually they, all over the world, they were getting sexual harassment attacks, just the usual, like being called feminazi. All of these issues are coming through strongly. And I think that's very hard. Participation itself is not going to change that. You hope that when adults see these amazing young women stand up and speak, that they're just blown away and they all change their stereotypes, but that doesn't happen. So you have to work really, really hard, I think, on attitudes and awareness, and that is a societal problem. It's not, it's not just for children, it's for women generally. And I think that's, this is a small aspect of that, but it's not going to cure it. But we do need to create. But I'm so surprised at Australia. And I think if somebody could help me understand that, why the committee chose to say girls in Australia.
We have a separate webinar about girls' positionality and women's positionality in Australia, certainly around the events of the last few weeks and the rise of the local Me Too movement. So we'll take it afterwards. Another recommendation the committee has made was with a suggestion that independent children's lawyer will be provided with adequate training to ensure that these lawyers have direct contact with children that they represent in the family court system. And independent children's lawyers are crucial to facilitate your model. And I was wondering if you can say a few words about what training they should get, what sort of training and what sort of content should go into this training.
Yeah. So this isn't an area where I have expertise. I mean, there are so many people who are doing great work on this, and I would strongly recommend, if you want good practice examples of that, to look at like the Council of Europe and European Commission and their concepts of child-friendly justice. And the European Commission in particular has given out a lot of funding to lots of organizations who've got together to develop really good training on child-friendly justice and training for lawyers, including training on ensuring that children's voices are heard in court processes. And so I think, there's so much there, and it's not an area where I normally work, although obviously people have taken the model and used it, helpfully, I hope, to look at those conditions. So, but it's not, Article 12.2 is not somewhere where I work specifically.
Thank you. Another question that came on the chat. Do you think, the question is, how can participants ensure or utilize the Lundy model of child participation in humanitarian and conflict setting?
Yeah, no, again, it has been used there. And I think it depends at what level that you're talking about. I mean, I think one of the areas where children are, I'm thinking about it in my own community at the minute. So I'm in a conflict setting. I wish I wasn't post-conflict, but I'm sure many of you will have seen the scenes of media in Northern Ireland again, where we've had riots and violence again in the past 2 weeks. And it looks like it's starting again yesterday after the funeral. I'm thinking really, really carefully, and I had a conversation yesterday with someone in our government about this. about how you actually get talking to young people in those contexts is actually really challenging. You know, it can be really challenging because of the kind of gatekeepers that are set up to protect the vested interests, you know, and actually getting to young people and ensuring that they are safe, that they're able to say what they think in contexts where communities are very much controlled and fearful and manipulated. So it's not easy, but again, I think it does create, we were talking about that yesterday, about again, going back to that, the safe space. How do you actually, that is the most important thing, and actually convincing that those young people that they will be safe and there won't be reprisal for having actually talked about their experiences. But I was emphasizing yesterday, and again, and I think it's really important when we're negotiating, you know, peace deals. There's often discussion about the fact that women are not involved enough and the major contribution they make in peace negotiations as they do here in Northern Ireland, but actually children, you know, and what are the ways in which we involve children in conflict situations in terms of negotiating peace and what's significant to them. So I feel really strongly about it, and I'm not here to sell a model, you know, I really am not. But what I think I want to say is that it is a way of thinking about it and applying it, as I said, that kind of paint by numbers, adding it in and thinking, well, what does that look like here on this issue with these children, and making people ask the questions that are in the Irish national framework. Those questions apply anywhere.
Lundy asks if you can say a few words about how you engage and work with cultural spaces to enlist parents and community elders where there is a dissonance with the child rights model.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such an important issue in Australia. I know there are going to be experts in the room, and I would not deign to actually suggest any, you know, how to do this, but I would think it's incredibly important. Where I have learned a lot is in your neighbour in New Zealand. I've been there quite a bit for various things, you know, visiting and talking to people, and I'm was really struck by, whenever you look at some of the cultural imperatives, you know, for their Maori community about family and community and the whānau, that it felt to me that there can be a bit of a tension, but they can also be read together. And I think for me, as a lawyer, the hook in that is Article 5 of the Convention. So Article 5 of the Convention is a really important and neglected provision, and no one knows my feelings on it. And Article 5 says that basically that parents and guardians and other adults have a right and a duty to advise and guide the child in the exercise of their rights. So parents and guardians and elders and communities, interpreted in that context, have a right and a duty to advise and guide children about their right to be heard. And I think there are ways of reading that, and you take in the rights in terms of culture and Article 29 about respect for parents, community and culture, that we need to read that right in a way that makes sense and is culturally acceptable and appropriate in certain communities. And I think it's doable. And I think that there will be some tensions, but I think that we can't exclude that and just take my model and land it, you know, without considering that cultural space.
Thank you very much. We are getting closer to an end, and although there are some more questions on the chat, I'm also mindful to the fact that some participants have joined us through their phones, and therefore they might not be able to type in their questions. So I will take my chances with opening the floor for anyone who would like to turn on their mic and introduce themselves and ask a question. And please keep it short and in the form of a question rather than of a statement, if anyone wants to take on this opportunity. Can you? Sorry.
I can't hear.
No, that was a bit unclear. I'm sorry. Does anyone want to have a go? No. So I think it's 5 to 6 here, and it's time to bring this webinar to an end. Laura Lundy, thank you very much for this very interesting and stimulating discussion, and for engaging with all of the questions in such detailed and candid manner. This webinar taught us a lot, and I think the last point was the strongest message of all. It's about adults who has the duty to ensure that children can realize their rights, and the foundation of the rights of the child and the duty to realize the rights of the child lies with parents and other caregivers and other adults, all the way up to politicians who might not like what they hear, but it's their duty to create a space for children to express their voices, and then to be the audience with the influence to facilitate that. We heard a lot about the need for collaboration and about the need to create inclusive spaces for different groups of children, and those spaces will look differently, and children should have the opportunity to design and participate in the process where these spaces are being created. And child-led design and child-led projects are the forefront of child participation. So it's about giving children a seat at the table from the very beginning when the table is being created. In any matter concerning children, they should be there. They should be there from day one. And we as adults should not be deterred by the challenges and the hiccups that we might face on the way, and be mindful to the objective, which is facilitating children agency and to realize the rights. And as a committee on the rights of the child have said, and as Laura have said in her writing, Article 12 is the key to facilitate all or most of the rights of children. And even if we take a more protective approach or paternalistic approach to children and we focus on their best interest, and genuine best interest analysis cannot be done without listening to children and realizing let them realize the Article 12 rights in this process. So thank you again, Laura, for joining us this afternoon or morning at your time. This was the fifth webinar in a series of webinars that we've organized together with the Diplomacy Training Program, Youth Law Australia, and the Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. Andrew Plankovich, Claire Sidoti, and Patrick Al from the DTP done a tremendous work in bringing this and enabling us to deliver this webinar to you, together with my colleague Faith Gordon from ANU College of Law. And this collaboration is a fantastic way to broaden the audience that we have in Australia and to continue our child rights training to everyone who is willing to participate. We began 3 years ago with some face-to-face 2 days workshops about children's rights, and we are very much hope that with the current COVID-19 conditions in Australia, we will be able to resume this training and to travel around and to meet all of you in person to some more subject-specific child rights training. We will meet again next month. Details to follow to discuss children's rights in the digital environment, following the latest concluding general comment published by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child earlier in the month about the rights of children in the digital environment. So all of you will get an invitation with details and time and location quite soon. Have a very good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming and thank you for participating. And please join me in thanking Laura for her engagement with us today.